But I am concerned that even as the serpent seduced Eve by his craftiness, so your minds may be corrupted and turned away from the straightforward simplicity of teaching about Christ. Verse 4. For if he that cometh preacheth another, allos, Jesus, just another one of many. He just preaches another Jesus. Talking about Jesus Christ, supposedly, but it's just another angle. Whom we have not preached, or if you receive another heteros, another of a different kind of spirit. See that? Because when you get another Jesus, you're going to get another of a different kind of spirit, which ye have not received, or another heteros of a different kind of gospel, which ye have not accepted. Ye might well bear with him. You might do better if you didn't bear with him. This last phrase is misleading in King James. The Aramaic means to be well persuaded, and the well is sort of an ironical sense again. Same way in the Greek, you put up with it well. Literally, it means, both those ideas mean to put up with it too easily. You put up with it. The putting up, bearing with, that's the same word you had back in verse 1. Bear with and bear with. This is that word again. You put up with these guys too easily. The Apostle Paul, now listen to this, was very concerned for the Corinthians because they easily put up with new ideas. That is, they did not muster much resistance to heretical ideas. This word has a legal usage, which means to accept a complaint. The Corinthians accepted the complaints from the outsiders quite easily. They swallowed it without much resistance. This word does not carry the idea of resistance, but rather it carries the sense of endurance or putting up with it. They were putting up with and becoming acclimatized to living with less than the best. Now this word, to put up with, I told you used it twice in verse 1. It's used here in this verse, and it's used two other times in this chapter, verse 19 and 20. In verse 19 it says, for you suffer fools gladly. You're always putting up with fools. And you're doing it with pleasure. I'll tell you more about that verse later on because it needs to be retranslated. But you're always putting up with these guys when you ought to take a stand. And verse 20, you put up with it if a man brings you to bondage, if he devours you, if he takes from you, if he exalts himself, if he smites you on the face. You're always putting up with these guys. And who are these guys? They're the super apostles. Wait till we get there. All right. Verse 4, I'm not going to give you a literal except for that last phrase which I would translate, you put up with it too easily. Verse 5. You see why he had reason to be jealous if they were going into other gospels, other spirits of a different kind, other Jesuses? No wonder the allegory of being jealous as a husband over them. Verse 5, for I suppose I was not a whit behind, means I was behind in nothing, of the very chiefest apostles. There they are. The very chiefest apostles. That means the most eminent or supereminent apostles. This word is used in Greek literature in an ironical sense. This does not refer to the 12 apostles, but rather is ironically used of the false apostles that are mentioned over in verse 13, for such are false apostles, deceitful workers, and he calls them super apostles. Here's the literal according to usage. Yet I consider myself in no way to be inferior to these precious but false super apostles. And precious, I mean there in the sense of, like you say, oh, these precious ones, ironically, all right? Yet I consider myself in no way to be inferior to these precious but false super apostles, the ones that you consider so precious, but they're false apostles. And that's why this is the satire on the super apostles. Verse 6. But though I be rude in speech, rude means unprofessional. It was standard practice for a professional speaker in Corinth or Greece to demand payment for speaking and teaching. But Paul did not. What did Paul do? He asked them to abundantly share. But the other speakers said, look, I'm speaking, you give me money. And where did it go? In the pocket. In their pocket. It was for their own personal gain. And since he did not take money that way, but rather he lived off of the abundant sharing that came from Macedonia and so on, where they of their own free will gave out of their hearts, they did not consider him a professional speaker, rhetorician. But though I be unprofessional in speech, in rhetoric, logos, yet not in knowledge, but we have been thoroughly made manifest among you in all things. You've seen our life. You've seen how we act. But they consider us unprofessional in speech, in rhetoric. Corinth was given to the sport of rhetoric. Paul's critics were professional rhetoricians, and they apparently seized every opportunity to lambast him. In Corinth, this was having an effect on the believers because rhetoric was so great a part of their local tradition. A man by the name of Chrysostom in the 4th and 5th century drew a vivid picture of Corinth during the Isthmian Games, which he alleges was according to a long-standing tradition. And I told you last week the Isthmian Games were held this year when this epistle was written, in the spring of this year. So were the Olympics. They were in the summer of this year. He wrote, you might hear, this is Chrysostom, you might hear many poor wretches of sophists shouting and abusing one another, and their disciples, as they call them, squabbling, and many writers of books reading their stupid compositions, and many poets singing their poems, and many jugglers exhibiting their marvels, and many soothsayers saying their giving the meaning of prodigies, and 10,000 rhetoricians twisting lawsuits, and no small number of traders driving their several trades. That's from Chrysostom. With so many ideas floating around, Corinth had a very liberal climate. And as I said, the Isthmian Games were held this year. So where do you think their heads were? Into what these rhetoricians were saying and the others that were at the games and that were constantly around Corinth. Remember Mars Hill? Some came there to do nothing else but to hear or to tell something new. And that's the way they were at Corinth. Always wanting to hear something new. That's why they thought Paul, but these all charged, they wanted money for speaking. But Paul, no money, except I want you to abundantly share. But out of your heart, not grudgingly, but out of your heart. See? What a difference. Verse 7. Have I committed an offense? Have I sinned in humbling myself, that you might be exalted or lifted up? Because I have preached to you the gospel of God freely. There it is. Without a charge. As a gift. Freely. What did the rhetoricians do? They wanted paid for their preaching or their teaching or whatever. See? They wanted wages. But not Paul. He said, you abundantly share. He preached the gospel of God freely as a gift. Verse 8. Oh, by the way, that's a rhetorical question. The question needed to be asked because some were saying that the apostle did not ask for money because he was not deserving of it, because he was only rude or unprofessional in speech. His critics would say if he were a genuine apostle, he would demand money. Now, how do I know that? Look at verse 8. I robbed other churches taking wages of them. Did he get his wages from the Corinthians? No. His wages came out of what? The abundant sharing. Not, demanding, look, I'm speaking, you give it to me, and then he'd line his pockets with it. But he lived off of the abundant sharing according to need, not to build up his Swiss bank account. Where you really put people in a bind. Boy, you've got to give, that kind of thing. It's got to be the love, abundant sharing, out of their hearts giving. See? Now, classes, room and board is a whole different story. You can't go any place and get free lunches, right? There ain't none. Room and board. If you go to a college, what do? You pay for the tuition for the classes. You have to pay for your books. That's not what we're talking about here. See, classes, room and board, like in your training in the Corps, college division, that's a whole different situation. But as far as preaching the Word, sharing the Word, moving the Word among the people and the fellowships, that's a whole different story. It's off of the abundant sharing. Not that, boy, you give it to me, and now I stick it in my pocket, line my pockets with gold, and off I go, which some would do. All right, wanted to clarify that. But it's a great verse. Paul was not like those rhetoricians. Verse 10, as the truth of Christ is in me, no man shall stop me of this boasting. What boasting? This boasting that I was not burdensome to you, a financial burden to you, but I had to rob other churches, taking my wages from them in order to preach the Word to you. Nothing's going to stop me from boasting in the regions of Achaia. Wherefore, or why? Because I don't love you? God knows. And that phrase, by the way, you got some rhetorical questions there again. Why? Because I don't love you? It's rhetorical. God knows is another figure of speech. Ekphonesis. And it's spelled E-C-P-H-O-N-E-S-I-S. Ekphonesis. This section, by the way, is loaded with figures. I already skipped a couple. I was hoping to give all of them to you tonight, but I see that's just going to take too long. But anyway, ekphonesis. You ought to see all these sometime. This is really a great chapter. I wish, well, anyway. Ekphonesis is an expression of feeling by way of exclamation. God knows. It's an expression of feeling by way of exclamation. God knows. Why? Because I don't love you? God knows. But, verse 12, what I do, what am I doing? I'm boasting. I'm boasting. How did he start this out? Oh, put up with me a little bit in my foolishness of boasting. But what I do in boasting about this abundant sharing, not taking rhetorical fees like the rhetoricians do. What I do, that I will continue to do, that I may cut off, surgically remove. That's how the word is used. Occasion, cause, or opportunity, that I can cut off any opportunity from them which desire an opportunity to boast. Those that want to boast. Now, who's been boasting at Corinth? These super apostles, these rhetoricians who live by the fees they collect. They're the ones that have been boasting about how great they are. Paul says, look, I, at this point, want to cut off their opportunity to boast. Those that want this opportunity to boast. That wherein they boast, glorious boast, they may be found even as we. Even as we means that they may be compared on the same level as us. Look here. These rhetoricians were boasting. The super apostles were. What was Paul doing? He was abased. He was humble back in verse 7. Have I committed a sin in humbling myself, that you should be exalted, that I preached without charge? What was he doing? He was down. He humbled himself. They were boasting up here. Now Paul says, what am I going to do? I'm going to boast. So where does that put Paul? On the same level as them. So we got something to compare by. Before you couldn't compare. At least the Corinthians couldn't. Now we got Paul boasting. We got the rhetoricians boasting. Now we can compare on the same level. By the same terms, the same standards. And that standard is the standard of boasting. And that's how he's going to cut off their opportunity to boast. They want to boast. I'm going to boast. Then we can compare boastings. Now, I give you a literal of verse 12, according to usage. But what I do in boasting, I will continue to do in order to cut off any opportunity from them which are constantly seeking an opportunity to boast. Period. Then those who boast may be assessed by the same standard as we. Period. Again. But what I do in boasting, I will continue to do, in order to cut off any opportunity from them which are constantly seeking an opportunity to boast. What's he doing? He's going to boast himself in order to cut off their boasting opportunity. Then those who boast may be assessed by the same standard as we. In other words, we're on the same standard. You're boasting, I'm boasting. Now we got something to compare by. So you cannot boast yourself out of our league. Verse 13. For such are false apostles, deceitful workers. These super apostles he's talking about, these rhetoricians, the ones that are boasting about themselves. They are what? False apostles, deceitful workers, transforming themselves into the apostles of Christ. They're disguising themselves as the apostles of Christ, but they're really apostles of something else. And no marvel, no wonder. It's no wonder. For Satan himself is transformed or disguised as an angel of light. He makes himself look as an angel of light. And how does Satan do that? Through his four fronts. Remember? Self, others, environment, and religion. That's his four fronts. And boy, you look at yourself, you're not too bad. Look at other people, why, they're pretty good. You look at environment, hey, it's not too bad. And religion, wow. See? That's his fronts. He transforms himself as an angel of light. Therefore, it's no great thing if his ministers also be transformed as the ministers of righteousness. They are disguised as the ministers of righteousness, whose end shall be according to their works. They're going to get their due deserts, their rewards. Verse 16. I say again. He says it again. He said it in verse 1. Verse 1 was, I wish you would put up with just a little of my foolishness. Please put up with me. Now he's going to say it again. Let no man think me a fool, if otherwise. In other words, if you do think I'm a fool, then put up with a little of my foolishness. Yet as a fool receive me. As a fool receive me, that I may boast myself a little. This again is irony. The essence is, give me at least as much attention as you would give a fool. See, let no man think me a fool, but if you do, if you think I'm a fool, then at least give me as much attention as you would a fool. This verse and verse 1 both imply that boasting of oneself is usually foolish. And who are the real fools if boasting is foolish? Those super apostles, those rhetoricians. But the Corinthians need to hear about the Apostle Paul to shake up their memories and to turn them from the teaching of the false apostles who are the real fools. And he's got to go on their level, their standard, to do it, which is boasting. It's like, think me a fool, but hear me.